Get out. 2 words, sharp as the razors hanging on the wall. The entire barbershop went quiet. Customers stopped mid-conversation. The sound of clippers died away. All eyes turned to the homeless man standing in the doorway, his weathered hands clutching a crumpled $20 bill. His hair hung past his shoulders, gray and matted from months on the street. His clothes were layers of thrift store finds and donated items that hadn't seen a washing machine in weeks. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Eyes that had seen too much. Eyes that carried weight no civilian could understand. The barber, immaculate in his pressed white coat, looked at him with disgust. I said, get out. We don't serve people like you here. The homeless man didn't move, just stood there, silent, holding that 20 like it was his last lifeline to dignity. Around him, the upscale customers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, others looking away in embarrassment. What none of them knew, what the barber couldn't see past the torn clothes and unwashed appearance, was that the quiet man in the doorway carried something on his chest that fewer than 4,000 living Americans possessed. Something that would change everything once it was discovered. Welcome to the Silent Ranks. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of our community. Prestige Barbershop sat on the corner of 5th and Main in the heart of the city's business district, its red and white poles spinning lazily in the afternoon sun. Through the large plate glass windows, passers-by could see leather chairs, mahogany fixtures, and walls lined with vintage photographs of well-dressed gentlemen from decades past. This wasn't a $20 chain salon. This was old-school luxury, where a haircut cost $80 and came with hot towel treatments, straight razor shaves, and the kind of personal attention that made successful men feel pampered. The clientele included lawyers, doctors, business executives, and politicians who scheduled their appointments weeks in advance. Marcus Sterling had owned the shop for 15 years, building it from a modest neighborhood barbershop into one of the city's premier grooming destinations. He prided himself on maintaining standards, on creating an atmosphere where important men could relax and conduct business while receiving impeccable service. The shop employed 4 barbers, all trained in classical techniques, all dressed in crisp white coats that were replaced daily. The floors were polished marble, the chairs were Italian leather, and every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that spoke of attention to detail and professional pride. That Tuesday afternoon, the shop was busy with its usual clientele. In Chair 1, a federal judge was getting his weekly trim while discussing a high-profile case with the businessman in Chair 2. Near the window, a city councilman waited his turn while reading the financial section of the newspaper. The atmosphere was one of quiet prosperity, hushed conversations, and the comfortable rituals of men who had achieved success. Marcus moved between customers with practiced efficiency, overseeing his staff, making small talk about sports and politics, ensuring that every detail of the experience met his exacting standards. He had built this business by understanding exactly what his customers wanted. Not just a haircut, but a retreat from the outside world, a place where they could exist among their own kind without the intrusions of everyday life. The homeless population in the city had grown significantly over the past few years. Marcus saw them every day through his windows, shuffling past with their shopping carts and cardboard signs, camping in doorways and alleys just blocks from his establishment. They were a constant reminder of the city's problems, a visible contradiction to the polished world he had created inside his shop. Most of them knew better than to come inside. The disparity between their circumstances and the shop's clientele was obvious even to those struggling with mental illness or addiction. But occasionally, someone would wander in, confused or desperate, and Marcus had developed a standard response that was swift and unmistakable. The afternoon was proceeding normally when the door chimed, and everyone looked up to see who was entering. What they saw made several customers visibly recoil. A man in his 60s, wearing layers of mismatched clothing that hung loosely on his thin frame. His hair was long and unkempt, his beard wild and untrimmed. He carried the unmistakable smell of someone who lived rough, a mixture of unwashed clothes, cigarette smoke, and the indefinable scent of the streets. Marcus looked up from the customer he was serving, his expression immediately hardening. This wasn't the first time someone from the street had wandered into his establishment, and he had learned that quick, decisive action was necessary to maintain the atmosphere his paying customers expected. The homeless man stood just inside the door, looking around with the careful wariness of someone accustomed to being unwelcome. His eyes took in the luxury of the surroundings, the well-dressed customers, the gleaming equipment. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as if recognizing that he didn't belong in this place. But then his hand moved to his pocket, withdrawing a wrinkled $20 bill that he smoothed carefully between his fingers. The gesture was almost ritualistic, as if he was steeling himself for what was to come. Marcus set down his tools and approached the man, his white coat pristine, his manner professionally cold. The conversation he was about to have was one he had conducted several times before, and he knew exactly how it would go. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the shop. "Can I help you?" The homeless man looked at him directly, his weathered face showing no hostility, just a quiet dignity that seemed incongruous with his appearance. When he spoke, his voice was steady, educated, with the remnants of authority that suggested he hadn't always been living on the streets. "I'd like a haircut," he said simply, holding up the $20 bill. "I know it's not enough for your full service, but I can pay something." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Around the shop, customers watched with the fascination of people witnessing a social collision. Some seemed curious about how Marcus would handle the situation. Others appeared annoyed that their peaceful afternoon was being disrupted. Marcus glanced back at his regular customers, reading their expressions, understanding without words that they expected him to maintain the standards that made them comfortable spending their money here. A homeless man in the chair next to them would violate the unspoken contract that made this place special. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he wasn't sorry at all, "but we're booked solid today. Perhaps you could try somewhere else." It was a lie, and everyone in the shop knew it. There were 2 empty chairs, and the appointment book on the counter was visible to anyone who cared to look. But it was the kind of lie that allowed everyone to maintain the fiction that this was about scheduling rather than prejudice. The homeless man looked at the empty chairs, then back at Marcus. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he understood exactly what was happening. "I can wait," he said quietly. "I'm not in a hurry." Marcus felt a flash of irritation. Most people in this situation would have taken the hint and left quietly. This man's persistence was forcing him to be more direct than he preferred to be in front of his customers. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice gaining an edge, "this is a high-end establishment. We cater to a specific clientele with specific expectations. I don't think this is the right place for you." The words were carefully chosen, designed to make the point without being explicitly discriminatory. But their meaning was unmistakable. The homeless man wasn't welcome here, not because of scheduling or availability, but because of who he was and how he looked. Several customers nodded approvingly. One muttered something about maintaining standards. Another went back to his newspaper, satisfied that the situation was being handled appropriately. But the homeless man didn't leave. He stood there, holding his $20, looking around the shop with eyes that seemed to be seeing something the others couldn't. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet sadness that was more unsettling than anger would have been. "I understand your concerns," he said, "but I'm just asking for a basic haircut. I have money. I won't cause any trouble." Marcus felt his patience wearing thin. The man's refusal to accept the subtle rejection was creating exactly the kind of scene he had hoped to avoid. Other customers were starting to pay more attention, and the comfortable atmosphere of the shop was being disrupted. "Look," Marcus said, dropping any pretense of politeness, "this isn't about money. This is about maintaining an environment that my regular customers expect. You clearly don't belong here." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of discomfort throughout the shop. Even customers who agreed with the sentiment seemed surprised by the bluntness of its delivery. The homeless man absorbed the rejection without visible reaction. He had clearly heard similar words before, in different contexts, from different people. But there was something in his stillness that suggested this particular dismissal carried extra weight. "I see," he said quietly. "I understand." He started to turn toward the door, the $20 bill still clutched in his weathered hand. For a moment, it seemed like the confrontation would end there, with quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation. But then Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Perhaps emboldened by the apparent support of his customers, perhaps simply tired of dealing with people he saw as problems, he decided to make his position absolutely clear. "And don't come back," he called out as the man reached for the door handle. "We don't serve people like you here. This is a respectable establishment." The words struck the homeless man like a physical blow. He stopped with his hand on the door, his shoulders tensing. Around the shop, the reaction was mixed. Some customers looked uncomfortable with the harshness of the dismissal. Others seemed satisfied that their territory had been defended. For a long moment, the homeless man stood frozen at the door. Then, slowly, he turned back toward the shop. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, but it carried a weight that made everyone listen. "People like me," he repeated slowly. "You mean American citizens who serve their country? People who answered the call when their nation needed them? People who sacrificed everything they had for the freedom that allows you to run this business?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty, but his commitment to his position was too strong to allow for retreat. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said dismissively. "I just know that my customers deserve better than having to sit next to someone who obviously can't take care of himself." "Can't take care of myself," the homeless man repeated, and for the first time, there was something harder in his voice. "You have no idea what I've taken care of, what I've seen, what I've done." The exchange might have continued escalating, but at that moment, one of the customers in the waiting area stood up abruptly. He was a man in his 70s, well-dressed, but with the bearing of someone who had seen military service. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at the homeless man with an expression of dawning recognition. "Dear God," the customer whispered, and his voice carried clearly through the suddenly quiet shop. "Tommy? Tommy Richardson?" The homeless man turned toward the voice, and for the first time since entering the shop, his expression changed. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like shame. "Hello, Colonel Morrison," he said quietly. The elderly customer stepped forward, his movements urgent, his face a mixture of shock and distress. "Tommy, what happened to you? Where have you been?" Marcus watched this exchange with growing confusion and concern. The dynamic in his shop had suddenly shifted in a way he didn't understand. The homeless man was no longer just an unwelcome intruder. He was someone with a name, someone with a history, someone who was being treated with obvious respect by one of the shop's most valued customers. Colonel Morrison reached the homeless man and stopped just short of embracing him, as if unsure whether such contact would be welcome. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to address the entire shop, "I want you to meet Master Sergeant Thomas Richardson, United States Army. He saved my life in Iraq." The words fell into the shop like a bomb, creating a silence so complete that the only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Every customer, every barber, every person in the room turned to stare at the man they had been ready to dismiss as worthless. Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Baghdad, 2005. Our convoy was hit by an IED. I was trapped in a burning vehicle with 2 other soldiers. Tommy here ran through enemy fire 3 times to pull us out. 3 times. Under direct fire from insurgents who were trying to kill him." The homeless man, Tommy, stood motionless as his story was told. He didn't look proud or defiant, just resigned, as if he had hoped this moment would never come. Morrison wasn't finished. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for that action. The Medal of Honor. Do you understand what that means? Marcus didn't understand, not fully, but he was beginning to grasp that something catastrophic was happening to his carefully controlled environment. The Medal of Honor was a name everyone recognized, even if they didn't know the details. It was the highest military decoration, reserved for acts of valor so extraordinary that they transcended normal heroism. There are fewer than 70 living Medal of Honor recipients. Morrison continued, his voice rising with indignation. "And you just told one of them that he doesn't belong here, that he's not good enough to sit in your chairs." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. Around the shop, customers who had nodded approvingly at the homeless man's dismissal now looked anywhere but at him. Tommy Richardson finally spoke, his voice still quiet, but carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. "It's all right, Colonel. They didn't know." But Colonel Morrison was far from finished. He had found his voice, and years of military command training were evident in his bearing as he addressed the room. "This man," he said, pointing to Tommy, "threw himself on a grenade to save his squad in Fallujah. Spent 8 months in military hospitals recovering from his wounds. When he came back, he couldn't adjust to civilian life. Started drinking, lost his family, lost his home, but he never lost his honor." Marcus wanted to disappear. The story being told was transforming the homeless man from an unwelcome intruder into something approaching sainthood. Every word Morrison spoke made Marcus's earlier behavior seem more inexcusable. "Colonel, please," Tommy said, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "That was a long time ago." "It was yesterday," Morrison replied firmly. "Honor doesn't have an expiration date. Service doesn't disappear because someone falls on hard times." Marcus knew he had to say something, had to try to salvage the situation, but every word that came to mind seemed inadequate. How do you apologize for treating a Medal of Honor recipient like garbage? How do you explain that you judged him based on his appearance without knowing anything about who he was or what he had done? I didn't know," Marcus finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Tommy turned to look at him, and Marcus was struck by the absence of anger in the man's eyes. There was sadness there and disappointment, but no rage. "You didn't want to know," Tommy said quietly. "You saw what you wanted to see and decided that was enough." The words were a gentle rebuke, but they hit Marcus harder than shouting would have. Because they were true. He had looked at Tommy and seen only homelessness, only poverty, only problems. He had never considered that there might be a story behind the appearance, a history that deserved respect. Colonel Morrison stepped forward, his bearing still military despite his civilian clothes. "Marcus, isn't it?" he said, reading the name tag on the barber's coat. "I've been coming here for 3 years. I've always been satisfied with the service. But I need you to understand something." Marcus nodded, afraid to speak. "This man," Morrison continued, indicating Tommy, "has earned the right to be treated with dignity anywhere in this country. Not because he's asking for charity, but because he's already paid a price that most of us can't imagine." Around the shop, other customers were beginning to stir uncomfortably. Several looked ashamed of their earlier reactions. One man, near the window, was Googling Medal of Honor on his phone, his face growing more somber as he read. Tommy Richardson stood in the middle of it all, the unwilling center of attention in a drama he had never asked to be part of. When he spoke, his voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I didn't come here looking for special treatment," he said. "I just wanted a haircut. I've been living rough for 2 years, and I finally saved enough money to do something about how I look. I thought maybe if I cleaned up a little, I could find work. Get back on my feet." The simple honesty of the statement was devastating. This wasn't about recognition or honor or military service. It was about a man trying to reclaim some dignity, trying to take a small step back toward the world he had lost. Marcus felt something break inside him. Not just embarrassment or professional concern, but genuine shame. He had looked at a man trying to better himself and decided he wasn't worth helping. He had judged based on appearance and assumed the worst about someone he knew nothing about. "Sir," Marcus said, and his voice was different now, stripped of its earlier authority. Would you let me cut your hair? No charge. I owe you that much, at least." Tommy looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether the offer was genuine or just damage control. Finally, he nodded once. "I'd appreciate that." What followed was the most unusual hour in the history of Prestige Barbershop. Marcus personally attended to Tommy Richardson, working with more care and attention than he had shown any customer in years. The other barbers stopped their work to watch, learning something about their profession that couldn't be taught in school. Colonel Morrison remained throughout the process, talking quietly with Tommy about mutual acquaintances, about what had happened in the years since Iraq, about the struggles that had brought a war hero to the streets. Other customers listened, some openly, others pretending to read while absorbing every word. As Marcus worked, Tommy's transformation was remarkable. The long, matted hair fell away to reveal features that spoke of strength and character. The wild beard was tamed into something dignified. When the hot towel treatment was finished and Tommy looked in the mirror, he was no longer the homeless man who had shuffled through the door. He looked like what he had always been, a soldier. Colonel Morrison had been making phone calls during the haircut, speaking in hushed tones near the window. When Tommy's service was complete, Morrison approached with news. Tommy, I've been talking to some people. There's a Veterans Assistance Program that's been looking for someone with your background. They need someone who understands what combat veterans go through when they come home. Someone who's been where they are. Tommy listened without comment, years of disappointment having taught him to be cautious about hope. It's not charity, Morrison continued. It's a job, a real job, helping other veterans. They want to interview you tomorrow if you're interested. For the first time since entering the shop, Tommy smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, but it transformed his entire face. I'd like that, he said quietly. Marcus watched this exchange with a mixture of emotions he couldn't fully identify. Relief that the situation was resolving positively. Shame that it had taken someone else to see Tommy's worth. And something deeper, a recognition that he had learned something important about judgment and worth and the danger of assumptions. As Tommy prepared to leave, Marcus approached him one final time. Sir, he said formally, I want you to know that you're welcome here anytime. And I want to apologize, not just for today, but for my attitude. I was wrong. Tommy nodded acceptance of the apology, then paused at the door. You run a nice establishment, he said. Just remember that you never know who might walk through that door or what they might have given for the freedom to do so. After Tommy left with Colonel Morrison, the shop remained quiet for a long time. Customers finished their services in subdued conversation. Barbers worked with unusual thoughtfulness. The comfortable atmosphere of exclusivity had been replaced by something more complex, more uncertain. Marcus spent the rest of the day thinking about what had happened. He had built his business on creating a space for successful people, but he had never considered that success might take different forms. He had equated worth with wealth, dignity with appearance, value with social status. That evening, Marcus did something he had never done before. He researched the Medal of Honor, learning about its history, its significance, its rarity. He read about the criteria for receiving it, the kind of valor it represented, the level of sacrifice it acknowledged. He learned that Thomas Richardson had indeed received the Medal of Honor for actions in Iraq, that his citation described extraordinary heroism under fire, that he had risked his life multiple times to save others. He learned that many Medal of Honor recipients struggled with civilian life, that the same qualities that made them heroes in war sometimes made them misfits in peace. The next morning, Marcus arrived at his shop early and did something unprecedented. He created a new policy, printed and framed, that he hung prominently near the entrance. This establishment serves all American veterans with honor and respect, regardless of circumstances. Military service is its own credential. A week later, Tommy Richardson returned to the shop. He was wearing a suit, his hair still neat from his previous visit, his bearing more confident. He had gotten the job Colonel Morrison had mentioned and was starting his new life helping other veterans navigate the transition to civilian life. Marcus personally served him again, and this time, their conversation was different. They talked about the challenges veterans faced, about the invisible wounds of war, about the responsibility of civilians to support those who had served. I learned something that day, Marcus told him. I learned that I was judging people by all the wrong standards. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. It's easy to do. I did it myself for a while. Judged myself by where I ended up instead of where I'd been. Sometimes we all need reminding of what really matters. Over the following months, Prestige Barbershop became known for something beyond luxury service. Word spread through the veterans community that it was a place where service was recognized and respected, where a man's military record mattered more than his bank account. Marcus began offering free services to veterans in need, not as charity, but as recognition of their service. He trained his staff to recognize military bearing, to understand the significance of service ribbons and medals, to treat every veteran with the respect they had earned. The shop's clientele evolved too. Successful businessmen still came for premium service, but they now shared the space with veterans from all walks of life. The atmosphere became richer, more diverse, more genuinely respectful of different kinds of achievement. Colonel Morrison became a regular advocate for the shop's new direction, bringing other veterans and sharing their stories. The walls that had once displayed only vintage photographs of anonymous gentlemen now included images of local veterans, their service records, their contributions to the community. Tommy Richardson's transformation became complete over the following year. His new job helping other veterans gave him purpose and stability. He found housing, reconnected with family members, and slowly rebuilt the life that war and its aftermath had taken from him. But he never forgot the lesson of that day in the barbershop, and neither did Marcus. Both men had learned something important about appearance and reality, about judgment and worth, about the danger of assuming that what you see is all there is. Sometimes the most important lessons come from our worst mistakes. Marcus Sterling had built a successful business by catering to society's elite, but he had almost missed serving one of its true heroes. The homeless man he had dismissed as worthless was carrying honor that most people could never earn, sacrifice that most people could never make. In the end, Thomas Richardson didn't need Marcus Sterling's validation. His worth wasn't determined by whether a barber would serve him or customers would sit beside him. His value was written in blood on foreign battlefields, certified by a grateful nation, and carried in the hearts of the men whose lives he had saved. But Marcus Sterling needed to learn who Thomas Richardson was, needed to understand what real worth looked like, needed to confront his own assumptions about success and failure, about appearance and reality, about who deserves respect and why. The Medal of Honor around Tommy's neck wasn't just recognition of his military service. It was a reminder that heroism doesn't always look the way we expect it to, that the most important qualities in a person aren't always visible from the outside, and that everyone who walks through our doors carries a story we know nothing about. In a world that too often judges by appearance, income, and social status, Tommy Richardson's story is a reminder that the most important measures of a person's worth aren't always the most obvious ones. Sometimes the man in torn clothes has given more for his country than the man in the expensive suit. Sometimes the person asking for help has already helped more people than those refusing to give it. Most importantly, it's a reminder that we never know who we're really talking to until we take the time to listen to their story. Everyone deserves that courtesy. Everyone has earned that respect. And everyone, regardless of their current circumstances, carries within them the full weight of their life's experiences, their sacrifices, their contributions to the world. Thomas Richardson had earned the right to be treated with dignity not because he was a Medal of Honor recipient, but because he was a human being. The medal just made his worthiness impossible to ignore. This story was brought to you by the Silent Ranks. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who served quietly, sacrificed without complaint, or gave of themselves in ways that went unnoticed by most of the world? Tell us in the comments about the unsung heroes in your life and how their example changed your understanding of what real worth looks like. And if you think stories like Tommy's need to be shared, if you believe we should never judge by appearances alone, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Every subscription helps us continue telling these important stories that remind us to look deeper, to judge less quickly, and to remember that everyone we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about. We'll see you in the next one, where we'll continue exploring the stories that challenge our assumptions, open our hearts, and remind us of the extraordinary people walking among us every day.